Today, I'm really excited to share with you my top books of 2020 and also my most disappointing books of 2020. Because I have so many books that I want to share with you, I'm going to be keeping the synopsis of the books pretty brief, but I just wanted to share with you some of the books that meant a lot to me and then also some of the books that didn't quite live up to what I was expecting. So without further ado, let's just get started with the top books that I read in 2020 in no particular order. So one of my favorite books of the year was The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. So I had previously picked up A Darker Shade of Magic by the same author and I really didn't like it. And so when I saw that this book was coming out, for some reason I just looked at the cover and I was like, this sounds really cool and it's just absolutely beautiful. I mean, it's one of my favorite book covers of the year, but I ended up loving this book. It's basically about this girl who makes a deal with the devil and then no one remembers her. I mean, I told you I'm gonna keep this pretty brief because I feel like this is a pretty talked about and well-known book. And so basically it's a fantasy book that goes back and forth in time between like the 1700s in France and common day or modern day New York City. And I just love this book because I thought the writing was incredibly beautiful. It was really atmospheric. It was the perfect book to read in the fall. I really love the character development in the book, and the two main characters are really great. This is a book I definitely want to give a reread just because I feel like I didn't totally understand the ending when I actually read it for the first time, but this is definitely in my top, I'd say, 5 books that I read in 2020. So one of my other top books of last year was also a fiction book. I'm going to have a lot of nonfiction on my top books. But that was In 5 Years by Rebecca Serrell. Again, this is one of those books I just saw the cover and I knew that I was really going to love it. I think that this cover is absolutely stunning. I mean, I love metallics on covers, aside from these stickers, which I think we need to boycott them because I feel like everyone in the book community actually hates them. But I love this book. It is a contemporary romance set in New York City, and it's about this woman who on her engagement night, she has this dream and she wakes up 5 years in the future and she has a different ring on her finger and is with a different guy. And I just thought that was a really interesting concept. This book actually surprised me and it wasn't quite what I was expecting. I thought this was just going to be like a romance book, but it actually had different elements than what I thought it was going to be, and the ending was just not what I was expecting at all. And I would just recommend if you like a romance that's not traditional. And yeah, that's all I'm going to say about it, but I ended up really loving this book. I read it in a weekend. It's pretty short. I did pick up The Dinner List by the same author and I didn't love it as much, which wasn't surprising to me, but In 5 Years is definitely one of my top favorite books that I read. So next is Marry Him, The Case for Settling for Mr. Goodenough by Lori Gottlieb. This was the first Lori Gottlieb book that I've read and it totally hooked me and I started getting really into her works. But I know this book sounds like really weird, but basically Lori is nearing 40 years old and she's still single and she's looking for Mr. Right, and she is just talking about her experience dating and what it means to be single when you're older, and also like what does it mean to have a fulfilling, lasting relationship, and why are women so picky when they're trying to pick a partner. I know this book just sounds like one of those relationship advice books. It's going to be really boring or may not relate to you in whatever period of your life you're in, but I love this book so much because even if you're not dating or interested in dating, or if you're with a partner, I think just like reading this book and hearing about her experience is so interesting. And I think that she makes really awesome and relevant points when it comes to modern dating. Even though this came out 10-ish years ago, she does talk a lot about online dating, which obviously can transfer to the apps and everything that we have today. I just thought this book was so entertaining and I just couldn't wait to pick it up again. So the 2 fiction books that I mentioned earlier, those are probably my favorite fiction of the year. I will say though, I don't think about those books a lot. The books that I think about, which I will be getting into the next few books, but this one is one of the books that I probably think about the most, or if not in the top 2 of things that I always think about and talk about a lot with people in my life. And this book definitely has made more of an impact on me than I would have thought. Obviously, some of the books that I'm going to be mentioning are relevant to me and what I've been through in the past year, but this book was just so amazing, and I really hope to reread it one day. I also read Lori Gottlieb's Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, A Therapist, Her Therapist, and Our Lives Revealed. I picked this book up after I read Marry Him, not right away, but I picked it up a little bit later. And again, I love her writing. I think she's such a relatable and insightful person just because she is so real with the things that she does in her life and her own fault. And then she's also very insightful because she works in the mental health space and is a therapist. And what this book is basically about, it basically opens with her going through this like really huge breakup, which is kind of interesting because this book took place like 10-ish years after Marry Him. And then so she talks about how devastating it was and how she went to a therapist, even though she is the therapist herself. And then also talks about the journey of her patients. I think they talk about like around 4 patients and their lives and the things that they've been through. And it was just really interesting to hear her life journey and how she was growing through something, and then also how she was helping other people grow through something. And I love this book just because it's like a case study on all these different people, and I just thought it was so cool to hear all of these people's stories. I think that there's a little bit, you could probably find a little bit of yourself in at least one person in the book, and I think that it just shows that there's more to people than what you perceive them to be. And I just thought it was like really interesting to get to know these characters and just to see them evolve. And I really like this book too. I obviously really like books that center on therapy and mental health, but this book doesn't read like a self-help book. It doesn't read like a nonfiction book. It honestly reads like a story where you're getting to know the characters and want to see where they end up. And I think Lori did a really good job about sharing about herself and her own life experience, and then also of the experience of her patients. So another book that made it to my top of the year was Attached, The New Science of Adult Attachment, How It Can Help You Find and Keep Love by Amir Levine and Rachel Heller. I love this book because it basically talks about attachment styles and relationships. So the 3 attachment styles are anxious, avoidant, and secure, and it goes through all of them and just explains to you what they are. You can figure out what attachment style you are. You can also figure out the attachment style your partner is, or just other people in your life. And I just thought this book was really insightful. It's based on science. It's actually more of a sciencey type book that has like studies and all of these interviews and stuff in it versus just kind of like more of a fluffy self-help book. And I just thought this was such an important and interesting to know as I move forward in my life and how I interact with the world. And I love this book. This is also probably in the top books that I talk about and think about a lot just because it's really impacted me and I learned a lot about myself while reading it. One thing I really liked about this nonfiction book is that I feel like nonfiction can be really repetitive, where it basically has one thesis and then every single chapter is just like a different version of saying the same thing. But I felt like throughout this entire book, I was getting more and more insight on the attachment styles, and I just feel like it wasn't being repetitive at all. I felt like it was really giving me new information along the way, and I ended up really, really loving this book. So one of my other top books was Group, How One Therapist and a Circle of Strangers Saved My Life by Christy Tate. This, if you're a fan of Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, this is a book that's very similar to that. I personally like Lori Gottlieb's writing / personality a little bit more than Christy, but I also really love this book because it has the themes that I like, which is like mental health and therapy and getting to know someone. So this is just talking about Christy, who is a successful lawyer who's really struggling in her personal life and decides to go to group therapy, and just talks about her experience in group therapy and her relationship with her therapist. I just thought it was like really interesting to hear about her relationships with men and just all of the things that she was going through in her life and her character development along the way. You can tell that I like character-driven plot lines, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. I really liked this book a lot. It was a very fast read for me. My one complaint was that I felt like she didn't focus on the group mates a lot. I felt like she was mainly focusing on herself, and I wish that she added a little bit more insights on what she learned from other people and made it more of about the group than just herself. But overall, I really love this book. It seems like I found a new genre of books that I like. So when you ever come upon a book about therapy, let me know and I will definitely be reading it. So I'm trying to keep this video like short and not just like talk about a bunch of different books that you probably don't care about. And I gave a lot of books 5 stars this year or last year, and I don't want to go through all of the 5-star books. I kind of just like wanted to share with you my top books that meant a lot to me. Like an honorable mention, which is funny, is The Paradox of Choice by Barry Schwartz. I actually give this book a 3-star, like 3.5, just because I thought that it could have been better written, and like the examples could have been a little bit better, but this book really changed my view on the world and like how I live my life, and also just showing me that you don't have to go through all options in order to be happy, to be more of a satisficer versus a maximizer. And yeah, I like this book a lot, even though like it was kind of like not the greatest reading experience, but yeah, I really love that book. There's just I don't know, I don't want to go through all my 5 stars. You can go through my wrap up if you're curious, all the books that I loved. I kind of just like want to move on to some of the books that did not live up to my expectations. But before I do that, I want to just share with you my favorite books that I read this year, but I didn't count them in the first part because I've already read them. They're rereads for me because I like to reread my favorite books every year, but I thought that I would mention them because technically those are my favorite books of the year. So I actually just reread All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque, which is a book. It's a classic written in like 1928 about Paul Baumer, who enlists in the German army to fight in World War I. It's one of my favorite books of all time. I lent it out to a friend, which is why I don't currently have it in my possession, but I like to reread this book every year, even though it just breaks me. Like, I forget how sad and impactful it is, but I obviously love this book a lot. The Light We Lost by Jill Santopolo. Obviously, the metallic cover is right up my alley. This is one of my favorite books of all time. I try to reread it every year. This was my 3rd reread, and it's a contemporary romance set in New York City. It's actually kind of, I wouldn't say it's similar to In 5 Years, but it has like a similar vibe. So if you've read one of them, you probably would like the other. But yeah, I just love this book. Also breaks me open. And every time I read it, I'm like, okay, I need a break. But yeah, love this book as well. I also reread my favorite fantasy book, which is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Was obviously doing a little bit of tabbing along the way, but so I technically read this in 2019, but I like finished the last 100 pages in 2020. So I just counted it as a 2020 book, even though it's like a little long. But this is, it's so hard to give a brief synopsis. I would just say it's like a grown-up Harry Potter, not grown-up, but like an adult version of Harry Potter. If you like Harry Potter, you'd probably like it. It has a lot of similar themes, but it's not like the same story at all, and the magic system in the world is completely different. But I mean, this book is what got me into fantasy, got me to like a fantasy book. I'm still struggling with the fantasy genre, but yeah, I reread this this is the first book I think I finished in 2020, or one of the first books. And then last but not least, we have This Love Story Will Self-Destruct by Leslie Cohen. I think this was my 2nd reread of this book, but yeah, it's a contemporary love story set in New York City. What's new, right? Like, I kind of have my specific genres that I like. If you've read In 5 Years, The Light We Lost, you'll probably like this one as well. I really like the characters. It doesn't have a good rating on Goodreads. Don't let that deter you. Make your own opinion. I've learned that this year. But yeah, this is more lighthearted than the other books. Like, this one is like not gonna break me and shatter me. It's more like it definitely is deep, but not like super heavy. So yeah, I am excited to reread this book again, maybe in 2021. We've come to the point where I will be talking about the most disappointing books I read in 2020. And the reason why I did disappointing versus worst is because I don't want to just say this book sucks and is bad, because I just don't really think that's fair. It's more like I was disappointed. You know what I'm saying? It's not like the worst book ever. Could be, but yeah, let's just get started with one of the first books that really disappointed me. So I ended up getting this book because this was like the very beginning of quarantine, and my friend recommended the series to me, and it sounded interesting, kind of sounded like adventure-y, and I wanted something that was like fun. Okay, I wouldn't say this book is fun. It's set in World War II, but something that was like more like fast-paced and was like bigger because I was bored and nothing to do. And that is Vienna Prelude by Bodhi and Brock Toon, I believe is how you pronounce it. I should have read the back of the book before I started talking about it. Okay, I don't even want to bore you. It's about this woman who is a violinist in Austria, I believe. She's half Jewish, her dad's Jewish. And yeah, I mean, yeah, set in World War II. This question on the back like really bothers me. It says, but will all their efforts be enough to stop the coming Holocaust? Like, no, like of course it's not going to be enough. Like, they did some good in the world, but you can't say you're going to like stop this huge and terrible thing just by one person making like a couple of nice efforts. But that's a whole other conversation. This book I didn't like because I just didn't like it. The love interest, like, I can't remember his name, who liked her, he was really, really weird. Like, he was like stalkerish, and like, I don't understand why they decided to make him like really, really creepy. The only character I actually liked in this book was her dad. He was like the most real and well-written character. I thought that like everyone else was like kind of poorly written. And this book is a Christian lit book, which not quite the genre that I generally go for. I at first was trying to ignore that and just read it for the story, but the further that I got on in the book, I was like, okay, I don't really want to hear a Bible verse right now, you know what I mean? This book was 450 pages long, and yeah, it was 450 pages too long. It's like this massive, massive series. Obviously, I just like got through this book and then I put it down. I'm never going to pick it up again. Unfortunately, I own a copy because none of the bookstores were open at the time. It would not, or not bookstores, the library wasn't open at the time. I would not have bought this book. I would have rented it from the library and saved my money. But yeah, that was Vienna Prelude. I might get some hate for this because I know a lot of people like this book. This is why I'm saying that these books aren't bad. They're just not for me, and they disappointed me. So, Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. This is obviously about, not obviously, you might not know. This is about a pandemic, and yeah, like the world is kind of like empty, and there's these like travelers roaming around. So yeah, again, I have not been reading the back of these books. I'm just going based off of my memory. But for the books I don't like, it's going to be a very, very slim memory. I don't like multiple point of views and multiple character perspectives. If you've read this book, you know that that's like the main thing. Like, it just bounces back and forth between all of these characters. You never really get connected to any of them. I've said a million times in this video, I'm a character-driven person, so I don't even know like what the plot is in this book, but I guess it's more plot-driven just because the main character was like, you didn't see her all that often, and I really, really did not like this book at all. Not my thing, did nothing for me. It's really popular. This just shows that Goodreads ratings will not determine your rating. And I gave this book a 1 star for me, although if you're into this kind of like genre and you like that type of writing style, I can get why you'd give it a higher rating, but didn't really sit well with me. So these next 2 books, I actually didn't realize I read them back to back, but that must have been a very great month for reading. The next is There There by Tommy Orange. I can see why people like this book. I thought the plot line was interesting, just like Station 11. I didn't like the multiple character perspectives. It doesn't work for me. This book is basically, so yeah, it's about Native Americans who are traveling to a powwow, which is at the end of the book, and it's like each of their individual perspectives that are woven together, which the concept was really interesting to me, but there were 12 main characters and I wasn't connected to any of them. There would be a point where I was introduced to a character and then I didn't see them again for 100 pages and then I'd forget who they were. And also their chapters were so short, so I just didn't get a sense of anybody. I thought that this book would have been better if there was like 3 or 4 main characters that had the interwoven story instead of 12. It didn't work for me. I can see why people like this book. It just, yeah, I can really only deal with a few main characters in a novel. So the book that I read right after that, I was so lucky. I picked up The Duchess Deal by Tessa Dare. So yeah, this was going around on BookTube. If you've seen it, it is a traditional romance book. If you can't tell, it has that mass market type look and the cheesy cover. this is not my genre. If I read romance, it's generally more contemporary romance and not like this type of romance. Yeah, it was like probably like the worst writing that I've ever written in a book, just to be perfectly honest. It wasn't well written. I don't think it's supposed to be though. It's supposed to be like a fun and light read. People are not reading these types of books for like beautiful literature and prose, and I get that, but like I just was not what I was expecting in a book. And absolutely no plot. The entire plot was on the love story. It was like a marriage for convenience. I'm not into any of those romance tropes. They're like not my thing. Marriage for convenience, friends to lovers, enemies to lovers. I don't care about any of that stuff. I just want like something that's like real. And yeah, and then the steamy scenes were like really lame. So it's like if you're reading the book for that, then it's like, this is a work of fiction. You can do anything. And I thought they were so lame. And yeah, that was the book. So The Duchess Steele. Yay. Never gonna read a romance book ever again. So I also picked up Beach Read by Emily Henry. So I consider this to be more of a contemporary romance versus like one of the traditional romance genre romances. Aside from the cover being beautiful and yellow, I love how bright it is. It just wasn't for me. It just didn't really hit me that well. I know that some people really like it. It's like more of a fluffy, lighthearted, fun read, which maybe I just am too serious of a person, but I like things that make me think a little bit more interesting. There's more dynamics in a romance, more interesting character development, and this book just kind of fell flat for me in those areas. I know some people like the only fluffy-ish type read that I like was The Honeymooners. I remember really liking that book, but usually those types of books don't really work for me. But yeah, I'm not gonna say it's a bad book because I know some people that really like it, but yeah, it didn't work for me at all. I'm like going through my list and I'm trying to not talk about every book that I read because it's kind of sad. Yeah, a lot of books disappointed me this year, or just like wasn't what I was expecting, and I don't want to bore you with all of the million books that disappointed me. So I read Writers and Lovers by Lily King. I actually gave this book a 3 out of 5 stars. I didn't think it was terrible, but the reason why I put it on this list was just because it wasn't what I was expecting. I thought the plot sounded really interesting. It's basically about this woman who's in her early 30s and just struggling to like find herself. She's a writer, but she's working as a waitress, and then there's these like 2 men that enter her life, and yeah, so it sounded really interesting because I usually like coming of age novels or people that are early on in their career. The writing just didn't work for me. Although I liked the plot, I just like thought the writing was a little bit too lyrical and poetic, and I didn't quite understand like what was actually happening. Sometimes I just like want like a real, you know, like I don't want a work of art. I want like a real raw story, and it just didn't quite hit me that way, even though I read this book pretty quickly and it did have that potential. It just fell a little bit flat for me. So yeah, it was more like a mid-range read, like a 3 out of 5 stars. Okay, like I forgot about that I read this book, but I feel like I should mention it because I really didn't like it. I didn't even give it a rating because I just felt like it'd be unfair. But that is Breakfast at Tiffany's in 3 Stories by Truman Capote. I read this because Breakfast at Tiffany's is set in New York City. And that was the first, it's like a novella collection basically. So that was the first novella. Didn't like the first one. And then I read the other 3 and didn't understand what was happening, didn't like them, didn't connect to them. I have no idea what they're about. And I was like, okay, maybe the first one wasn't as bad. Like if the last 3 were 1 star, then the first one was like a 2. And it just, I don't know what it was. Like he's such a famous author. I just did not connect to it at all. And because it's like a classic, I was like, maybe I'm missing something. I'm not going to give it a rating. And yeah, that was Breakfast at Tiffany's. I probably should just watch the movie instead of reading the book. But yeah, Breakfast at Tiffany's was a no star book for me. Oh my god, this book exhausts me just thinking about it. It's Wild from Lost to Found on the Pacific Crest Trail by Cheryl Strayed. Oh my god, I listened to this book on audio and it felt like a lifetime until I actually finished it. It was so freaking long, considering that it's not even that dense of a book. And it's basically, this sounds so mean, so But it's funny because I read another Cheryl Strayed book last year that was like a 5-star, and this book just did not work for me. And it's basically a memoir about Cheryl Strayed, whose mother recently passed away, and she's like in her early 20s and kind of lost. She just went through a divorce, and she decides to hike the Pacific Crest Trail, and it just talks about the trials and experiences she had on the trail, which was not interesting to me. I wanted more of a memoir where it offered more insight, it gave more interesting stories, and it was just her walking on the trail for most of the book. And the people that she met, who, you know, she had very brief encounters with, so you didn't really get to know them that well. There was like one touching part at the end of the book, but overall this book was a slog to get through, and I listened to it. That's like, when you listen to a book and you can barely get through it, like, that's pretty bad. So yeah, that was Wild by Cheryl Strayed. There's probably like way more books that I was disappointed by than I actually liked, and that's just how it goes when you're a picky reader. But the next is The Gentleman's Guide to Getting Lucky by Mackenzie Lee. This is like a novella inside of like the Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue trilogy series. I can't remember what like the series is called. Like, I mean, it's a novella. Like, I wasn't expecting it to be that great. I also hadn't heard of it, and it's between books 1 and 2, I think. Yeah, because the 3rd book hasn't come out yet. Yeah, it was like really weird and not that interesting, but it didn't add a lot to the story. I'm actually really excited for the 3rd book to actually come out. This book was just like, okay, that's a novella just to, it's kind of like a money-making thing. Just wanted to keep the series, you know, relevant, even though the 3rd book keeps getting pushed back. But I'm more excited to read that book than I was the novella. I read Eat, Pray, Love last year. I loved it. It's a memoir. And I mean, if you don't know, it's about Elizabeth Gilbert, who goes to Italy, India, Indonesia, does her like, you know, Eat, Pray, Love journey and all that. So I was really inspired by the book. I really liked it. I gave it a 5 stars. I don't know why I didn't put it on my like top books of last year, just because I don't really think about it a lot. So, but I did really love it when I listened to it. And then I read Eat, Pray, Love Made Me Do It, which is a short story collection. Yeah, short story collection about people that were inspired by Eat, Pray, Love, because I was like getting really into Elizabeth Gilbert. I read so many books by her last year. And this book was, yeah, no, it didn't work for me. Again, when you listen to a book on audio and you can barely get through it, like, it's being fed to you, and I could not even deal with it. But this book is basically just like people that were inspired by Eat, Pray, Love, the memoir, and how it changed their life, which sounds great. I just feel like there was too many stories, and it didn't go into depth into anyone. So they'd say, I went through this, I went through that, but then it really didn't dive deeper, and it almost felt like you were reading testimonials, and they all followed like the same formula, like this happened, then I read Eat, Pray, Love, and then blah blah blah. It's like, tell me like an actual story. Like, don't just like give me like little testimonials. And just was not what I was expecting at all. If they had slimmed down the amount of people that contributed to the book and just like really dove into like 3 or 4 stories, I think it would have been really interesting. But it was kind of just like listening to a bunch of Amazon reviews, and it was not my thing. It's like sad, like I'm like going through all these books, I'm like, which one should I talk about? This one, this one, this one, this one. It's like, okay, well, I don't want to, should I just make like a what I read in 2020 and like just talk about all of the books and why they all disappointed me in different ways? It's really, really sad. So the last book that I read last year was The Lions of Fifth Avenue by Fiona Davis. I might just end it on this note because I don't want to sit here all day and complain about all the books that I read last year. This book, I was so excited for. I thought that I'd love it. It's about the New York Public Library in New York City. So it's in New York City. It's about books. I mean, those are like some of my 2 favorite things. Yeah, didn't like it. It was too fluffy. It didn't work for me. It's a feel-good read. It honestly should have, sounds really mean. It kind of should have been like this size, if you know what I'm talking about. And not the worst book. Like, it was fine. It was light and easy. It's a really good vacation read in the winter. But for something that's like insightful and interesting, no. It's kind of like a mystery book. And the mystery was like, you know, did I see the end coming? No. The person like who did the thing was really random. I would not have seen that coming, but I also am not like a mystery person, so I don't really care who actually did it. But yeah, that was The Lions of Fifth Avenue by Fiona Davis. Oh my gosh, that was like a lot more than I thought. Like, how many books did I say I liked versus didn't like? And I feel like I'm leaving a lot of 5-star books out that could have easily been on this video, and I'm also leaving a bunch of books that I gave like decent ratings but like had things in them that I didn't like. I feel like that wasn't worth your time to listen to that. But yeah, those were my top books of 2020 and my most disappointing books of 2020. I would love to know actually tell me this. What was your favorite book that you read in 2020 and your least favorite book? I think that's kind of interesting. So leave those down in the comment below. But thank you so much for getting all the way till the end of this video. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And I will see you guys in the next one.